Think about communication or even presentations in particular. You see, a presentation is an opportunity to make a great first impression. It's like a first date. And the problem I see is that so many people and companies make the huge mistake of making an invisible first impression when presenting, when communicating their ideas. So it's not that they make a bad impression, although sometimes they do, but for sure, they don't make a good first impression either. It's just invisible. And we want to change that. And that's what we are going to do in this session. So by the end of this webinar, you will have a very good understanding in terms of how you can be more visible when presenting, when communicating your ideas. And if you think about it, now think about presentations in general, or maybe think about the last presentation you attended. In general, what is it that you don't like about presentations? Please, let's make this as interactive as possible. Use the chat box. There is no right or wrong answer. What is it that normally you don't like about presentations? Let me know your ideas in the chat box. Too wordy. Baju says too wordy. Absolutely. The record, yeah. Reading a script, reading slides. We are going to talk about that. Words on slides, no visual, scripted. Absolutely. Thank you very much. I see that every day at schools, conferences, business meetings, even online now. And you see, it's important to understand what's wrong with presentations so we can fix it. And if you want to fix it, if you really want to improve your ability to communicate your ideas, then you need to make sure that your communication, your presentations include 5 key principles. 5 principles. And that's what we're going to talk about today. And before we do, now, unlike Todd, everybody knows Todd, but for anybody who doesn't know me, like everybody, super quick introduction from my side. Now, my name is Andrea. I'm a presentation coach. I'm the founder of Ideas on Stage UK, but we are also in Paris, Milan, Barcelona, and LA in the US. For example, we've got Phil Wakenell, who is the co-founder of Ideas on Stage, based in our office in Paris. Phil, feel free to say hi. Exactly, that's me. Fantastic. Great to have you here, Phil, as well. And in the last 10 years, we've been working with thousands of clients, from the small business owner and professional, all the way up to clients like Microsoft, Lacoste, the World Bank. We've been coaching more than 400 TEDx speakers so far. And we specialize in working with established business owners or professionals who want to either grow their business or increase their influence and reputation and boost their career through great presenting. And my vision for the next 10 years is to help 1,000 purpose-driven entrepreneurs share the message, make an impact, and be memorable. Why? Because I believe that if you want to make an impact, the best thing you can do is to be an entrepreneur who has a vision that goes beyond just making money. And I know that for them, if they can use their voice for good and we like to help them, then we can all contribute to changing the world for the better. So that's why we do what we do. But enough about me. We are here to talk about the 5 key principles for successful presentations. What are these principles? Remember the word score. When you communicate your ideas, you want to score with your presentations, like in football or soccer, if you are in the US. And you see, P-SCORE stands for presentation score. That's our framework. That's what we use when we work with our clients. And SCORE stands for simple, clear, original, related, and enjoyable. These are the 5 principles. Now, I want to leave as much time as possible for Todd. So I'm afraid we don't have time to go through all the 5 principles today. So what I want to do is I want to give you 3 key ideas. By the end of the next 15 minutes or so, you will have a very good understanding in terms of how you can develop a message when you communicate, which is simple, clear, and related. Okay? And before we get started, please give me a quick exclamation mark, an exclamation point in the chat box if you are all ready to get started, and then I go. Phil says real football. Yeah, absolutely. I don't know if Todd agrees with you, but yeah. Oh, I see Mike Thompson again. Fantastic. Great to see you. Perfect. Great to see the exclamation marks coming in. Let's get started then. Simple. You need to be able to simplify your message when you communicate. Now, if you think about writing, for example, all experienced writers know that the secret to great writing isn't in what they say, it's in what they don't say. The more they remove, the better the article or the better the book. The same is true with presentations. You see, often the mistake I see is that as presenters, we know so much about our subject that we think that everything is important. And so we need to communicate everything. Isn't that true? But put yourselves in your audience's shoes. If everything is important, then for them, nothing is important. We used to work with a client some time ago. His name is Luc Breton from France. And he always liked to say, I only remember one thing from a pitch, from a presentation. Just tell me what I need to know. No more. Have you ever thought about this? For example, think about your next presentation. What's your one thing? If you were to summarize the core idea behind your next presentation in one message, what would you say? And how would you say in maximum 70 words? 30 seconds, that's it. I can promise you, if you can communicate your message in that time, then you can communicate it in longer. If not, your message isn't simple enough. And if you get stuck, give it a try. After this session, give it a try. If you get stuck, if you don't know what to say in your 70 words, then consider following this format. What, so what next? Now, first of all, you want to tell your audience the what. What do they need to remember? What do they need to understand from your message? But that's not enough. Always ask yourselves a very simple but very powerful question. So what? Why should they care? Why is this relevant and important to them, to your audience, not to you as the presenter? And then what next? Okay, now that they care, now that they understand why it's important to them, what do you want them to do after your presentation? And you see, that's one way you can simplify your message. Remember, what, so what next, in maximum, it could be less, it can be more, maximum 70 words. Okay? And before we continue with the second principle, please give me another quick exclamation mark in the chat box if this 70-word what, so what next format is useful and it's something that you could try and apply to your next presentations or communications in general. All right, perfect. Great to see them. All right, so let's move on. Second principle, clear. You also need to be able to create a clear structure when presenting, when communicating. And here is the thing. Depending on your audience and what they need, the type of presentation, the context, your objective, there are certain structures that work better than others. Now, again, I'm afraid we don't have time to go through all the different possibilities that you have. But if there is one thing that I would really like you to consider is this. And actually, let me ask you a question. Be ready in the chat box. What do you think is the most important number in communication? 1 to 10. Just give me a number in the chat box. Hug says 3, 3, 3, 3. Yeah, absolutely. And the winner is everybody. Absolutely. 3 is a magic number. Why? It comes from science. If you look at how our brain works, all of us, we find it very, very hard to remember more than roughly 3 pieces of information in short-term memory. So I don't care, and please trust me, nobody does, whether you have 12 reasons or 27 reasons or 1,000 reasons why they should listen to you or believe in your ideas or buy your products or services. Just give them 3. That's what people can remember. So your clear structure could be as simple as a quick and interesting introduction that catches your audience's attention. Then you communicate your 3 key messages, and then a powerful conclusion, making it very clear to your audience what was your point and why they should care about it. If you're not doing this today, if you're not paying attention to the way you structure your presentations, you are making it hard for your audience to follow you, remember what you say, and do anything and take action. And that's why this is so important. Okay? And as always, before we close with this part, with the last principle, give me one more exclamation mark. By the way, this is called the rule of 3, which is a fundamental principle in communication. Give me a quick exclamation mark in the chat box if this is useful and if it's something that you could try and apply to your next presentations. Okay, perfect. And then finally, one more principle for today related. And I have another question for you. Be ready in the chat box, please. Let's say that in a couple of weeks, you need to give a presentation. Today, you start working on it. What do? What's the first thing you normally do when you start working on a presentation? And please, before you type anything, don't tell me what you think you should be doing. Tell me what you actually do. Please, let me know in the chat box. Okay, mind map, make an outline, blueprint, skeleton. Jackie says, know your audience. Jackie, great to see you here. Homework from Zach, research. Great. As I always said, there is never a right or wrong answer 100%, but what's really, really important is that, as Jackie said, for example, we need to start with the audience. When you give a presentation, it's their presentation, not yours. It's always the audience's presentation. Think of a presentation as a present. If I want to give you a present, it's your present, not mine. And so I need to make sure that I know you so that I can buy something that you like. A presentation is very similar. When you give people a presentation, it's their presentation, not yours. And so you need to make sure that you know your audience, definitely before you open up PowerPoint, but also before you start thinking about some of the things that I've seen in the chat box, like your outline and the skeleton and the topic. That depends on the audience and what they need. So how can you do that? In practice, here is a very simple but super useful exercise that you can do in preparation for any presentation. You always need to start with the ABC. That's the ABC of preparation: audience, burning needs, context. So take some time and ask yourself some questions about the audience. Who are they? About their burning needs. What do they really need? What do they expect from your presentation? And also a little bit about the context, also some logistical things. Now, if you don't do this today, then there is, I'm not saying that if you don't know your audience, then you can't create a great presentation. You can, but the risk is that you develop a fantastic presentation, but for the wrong audience. For example, and this is a true story, some time ago, we were working with a client. Her name is Marine from France. And Marine is an executive. She's an expert in leadership. And she was invited by an association in Finland to give a talk about leadership. And she was super excited. It was one of her first international speaking opportunities. And so she prepared very well. She knew her message, what she wanted to communicate. She told us she had 50 beautifully designed slides, and also she rehearsed properly. So she was ready to go. She flew to Finland the day before the conference, then arrived there on the day, half an hour before the audience, because she wanted to make sure that she had time to set things up. And when she was about to connect her laptop to the screen, she realized that there was no screen. So a little bit of panic. She went and asked the organizers, assuming that they would say, oh, sorry, Marie, now we are going to fix this for you. We are going to find a screen somewhere. But actually what they did was they started laughing. They started laughing. And so she says, why are you laughing? And they say, look, Maureen, you want to show 50 slides, but actually you've been invited to give a talk to the association in Finland of blind people. Blind people. Now, I know it's an extreme example, but it happened for real. Maureen was very well prepared, apart from one thing. She didn't know her audience. She didn't even take the time to translate the name of the association from Finnish to French, and she would have realized that perhaps there was no need to have 50 beautiful slides. So remember, if you want to make it related, like relevant to your audience, always start with the ABC of preparation. And there you go. That's what I want you to do from now on. I want you to score with your presentations. Now, we had time to cover 3 principles, but in principle, you want to score simple, clear, original, related, and enjoyable. Simple, because the more you say, the less they remember. So you need to keep it short, simple, and to the point. Clear, because your key messages should be obvious to everybody. Original, because you want your presentation to stand out, to be a bit different, so that they will pay more attention and remember it for longer. Related, because remember, it's their presentation, not yours. And so you need to make sure that what you say is useful and relevant to them, to your audience, not to you. And then enjoyable. Well, of course, if your audience enjoys your talk, again, they will pay more attention and remember more. And that's it from my side. Now I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it's been useful. I'm going to hand you over to Todd now. Now, before I do, let me just mention this. If you enjoyed this part, if you are interested in presentation skills, and if you would like to learn a little bit more about how what we've covered so far could be applied to you specifically, then what you can do is you can express your interest today in a free consultation. Now, this is a 1-hour consultation with me. It's something that we normally charge for, but as a thank you for you attending this session, I would be very happy to offer it for free. Now, it's not for everybody. This is only for established business owners or professionals, senior professionals who are serious about taking their presentation skills to a higher level and who are also serious about taking action to make it happen. So if you're interested, just type here. I see some yes already here in the chat box. Do that. Of course, there is no commitment from your side. If you type yes in the chat box, what that means is that you are simply expressing your interest in learning more about the consultation. And then what I'll do is I'll get in touch to see if you qualify. And if that's the case, we'll go ahead and we have a chat. Thank you very much. And now, Todd, the stage is all yours. Todd is going to talk about how you can leverage visual thinking in communication and why this is super important for you as a business leader. Thank you, Todd. The stage is all yours. You are on mute, Todd, just so you know, yeah?
Rule number 1 of presenting is turn your microphone on. Rule number 2, little tip here, is also turn your timer on. I only have 20 minutes, so I use an official timer to make sure I don't go over into the next presenter's slot. In this case, it's going to be a Q&A. So we're going to try to make this as experiential as possible, despite the fact that we're doing this globally and on Zoom and with so many people in attendance. So my focus today, I'm going to try to be as simple, clear, original, and related and enjoyable as possible, and following up on Andrea. So what is visual leadership, and how can we leverage the power of visual thinking in communication? And I just want to plant the seed. We're talking about visuals and visual communication, but I want you to think about Andrea's example, that impactful example of presenting to a blind audience. How can you present visually even to people who may not be able to see? We're going to answer that question at the very end. So what is visual leadership? That is the focus of the work that I do. Visual leadership is basically the application of visual thinking and visual communication to the world of leadership. And it's actually the name of my book that was just released by Simon & Schuster back in May. So you're going to get some highlights from the book and some points on how you can incorporate visual thinking and visual language into your presentation. So with that, I'll just learn how to do this. Ready? Here we go. Let's get started. Wait, I have to do it one more time. You don't want to overdo special effects when you're presenting, but a little bit of fun, a little bit of enjoyment. I just learned how to do this. So let's turn the page and jump right into the content. So visual leadership, as I just said, is applying visual thinking into the world of leadership. But I want to reframe leadership as we are all leaders. We are not talking about CEOs or VPs or titles. We are talking about being a leader, and everyone on this call is a leader, even if you're only leading your own life or leading the people to whom you're delivering your presentation. So we want to first ask, how could you be a more visual leader? And what does it mean to have a leadership vision, right? When you start a presentation, you should have a vision in your mind's eye of what you want the outcome to be. What do you want people to think, feel, know, and do at the end of your presentation? What is your call to action, right? So I'm going to repeat that again. What do you want your audience to think, to feel on an emotional level, to know, and to ultimately do when they leave their presentation? In this case, we want you to think about how you can be more visual, and we want you to start using some of these techniques that we're talking about today in your own presentations. So with that, what is visual thinking all about? What do we mean when we're talking about visual thinking? So what I'd like you to do right now is in the chat box, how would you define or describe it? Whether you've heard the term before, whether you think you're a visual thinker or not, what do you think we mean? And I'm having trouble seeing the chat box. So Andrea, if you can give me some of the highlights. It must be behind my screen. I don't want to mess things up. So what are people writing?
Insights. I see here insights. Think in terms of relationships, shapes, buckets, pictures, or story to understand.
Great, great. I love it. So in a nutshell, visual thinking, those are all right answers, but in a nutshell, visual thinking is about using pictures, thinking in pictures. Now, I just used the metaphor in a nutshell along with a visual of a nutshell. So it's not a literal nutshell, right? It's a metaphorical. And what do we mean when we say something in a nutshell? We're saying as brief or as small as possible, as conciseness, right? But we use this language all the time. So one of the key things to think about is how can you use metaphors and analogies in your presentation, but use metaphors and analogies that relate to your audience. So for example, if I'm presenting to a global audience, I may talk about soccer/football, not baseball. Even though I'm a huge baseball fan, I may want to talk about cricket or rugby or tennis, right? You want to think about what are the metaphors and examples that will resonate with your audience, as Andrea told us before, right? So if visual thinking is about thinking in pictures and communicating in pictures, this is what we're talking about. You have an idea in your head. Now think about this. We all know that a light bulb represents an idea, but why? Right? Think about that. When did this first start? And I actually looked this up, and it was in Felix the Cat animated cartoons from the 1920s, not long after the light bulb was invented, that the light bulb was first used to represent having a flash of an idea, like the light going off. But it's so common now, what do we even think about it? Probably not, right? So what we want to do today is get more of an awareness of the visuals around us and the visual language that we use. So you have an idea. The next thing you need to do is frame that idea, metaphor, in terms of who's our audience and what's our purpose, just as Andrea was just talking to us about. How can we my wife, here's a real life example of framing something. My wife showed me a painting that she had, and I thought, oh, it's just okay. I don't love it. Then she got it framed, and I was like, wow, that's beautiful. I really like it, right? The same picture, but it was the frame that made the picture. Similarly, how are you going to frame your idea in such a way that it resonates with your audience so that their light bulb lights up and that person can say, I see what you're saying. And if you think about it, this phrase, I see what you're saying, is the foundation of every communication, whether it's an email or a small group or a TED Talk. When I did my first TED Talk last year, by the way, on the power of visual thinking, if you want to look that up and watch it. The foundation of all communication is getting other people to see what you're saying. How do you get an idea out of your mind's eye and into someone else's? And the term to see something in your mind's eye was coined by Shakespeare in Hamlet, when he saw the ghost of his father and did not know if it was a figment of his imagination or if it was a real ghost. He said to Horatio, I see my father. I think I see my father in my mind's eye, right? So how do you get a picture from your mind's eye and into someone else's? That is what this is all about. So just think about this. In what ways do you currently use visuals when communicating to get others to see what you're saying? Do you use drawings? Do you use PowerPoint slides? Do you use demonstrations? Do you use metaphor and analogy? How do you currently do it? So just start thinking about that as I walk you through some of my concepts right now. But the first thing I want to pose is, why visuals? What is it about visuals that are so impactful, that are so memorable, right? So as I'm talking, I would bet that most of you are looking to the left because our eyes are magnetically drawn to visual imagery. That is just the way our brains are wired. So how can visuals help us to be more effective thinkers, innovators, communicators, and leaders? Let's talk about that right now. And I sum it up in A, C, and R, 3 words. And this is consistent with Andrea's rule of 3, right? We were just talking about that magic number in presenting. The 3 words A, C, and R stand for attention, comprehension, and retention. So I'll keep it up there on the screen for a second if you want to write that down. Attention, comprehension, and retention. So let me go through each of them one at a time. So when you use a visual imagery or visual language, it captures people's attention. It gets them to focus. So right now, because I have a really cool blue slide with a cool, fun image on there, hopefully you're all looking at this. You're not checking your phone. You're not checking your email. I got your attention, right? Comprehension. When you use a visual in addition to words, it increases people's understanding. They could see what you're saying. And retention, the brain is just wired this way. When we see something visually, we tend to have greater recall and better memory. So that's attention, comprehension, and retention. This is why visuals are so impactful. Let me give you a real life example of this. This is I teach, I didn't tell you anything about my background. My company is called Big Blue Gumball. We make training entertaining, and we do management, leadership, and presentation skills training and coaching. And I also teach leadership at NYU in Columbia. And as I mentioned, I'm a TEDx speaker, and my book just came out. So this is the syllabus for my NYU graduate class in leadership. This is the reading list. You look at it, you see all the text, and it's really boring. Here is the same information. This is the same information as this. Put them side by side, text versus images. Which one gets your attention? Which one increases your understanding? Which one makes you want to buy and look up and open that book? Which one are you going to remember? If I hit this right now and I ask you to name the titles, I do this in longer programs. From the text list, people can maybe name 1 or 2. From the visual, people can name 5 or 6. Why is that? Again, it's the power of visuals in action. Visuals reach both sides of the brain, mainly the right side of the brain. So when the 2 sides of the brain are fighting it out, the right side always wins. And for proof of this, I've watched this video for hours on end, and the guy on the right always wins. So that is scientific, validated proof that the right brain always wins. Now, there's 2 principles at play here, just to put the humor aside for a second, 2 scientific principles. One is called picture superiority effect, and the other is called dual coding theory. But what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to shut off these dueling guys because I'm sure it's distracting you. It was distracting me, right? So the picture superiority effect, and you could Google both of these if you want more information, but picture superiority effect very simply says that when text and visuals are battling it out, the picture wins. Pictures are superior to text alone when communicating information. It's just how our brains are wired. And the second theory is dual coding theory. Now it's dual as in 2, not D-U-E-L as in the fencing duel that we were just watching. So dual coding theory, meaning 2, is that when you provide information using text in combination with images, it increases our attention, comprehension, and retention. So it hits both sides of the brain, and it makes it more memorable, and it makes it more understandable. So those are the two theories if you want to look into them in more detail, but that's just the little brain science behind why this is so. Now, that's why a picture is worth 1,000 words. It's an expression we all know. And even Napoleon said a good sketch is better than a long speech. Although he probably said it in French. I'm not sure that he spoke English, but let's just assume that it translates, right? So why is it that a sketch is better than a speech? Or when you use both in combination, then you're using dual coding theory. Now, let me give you my 4 ways to think and communicate more visually. And what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to slow it down for a minute. My wife gave me this. This is a little seashell. It represents a snail, and the snail is supposed to remind me to slow down a little bit because I'm from New York and I talk really fast, but it never works. So let me just throw that behind you. So here are my 4 ways to communicate and think more visually. Now you see the visual icons. Let's take a look at each visual icon. The first one, person holding a pen, that represents visual imagery and drawing. That's one way to do it. You could use slides, you could use a demonstration, or you could sketch something out. You could do a napkin sketch. You could get up at a whiteboard. You could get up at a flip chart, right? There's all kinds of ways to represent your ideas visually. You could use a tablet, right? There's all kinds of ways. The second one, if we look at this pie chart, this represents using mental models and frameworks. A mental model could be a mental map. It could be a diagram, a flow chart, a 4-box matrix, a pyramid. There's all kinds, an organizational chart, right? If you have a company and you look at your organizational chart, that's a framework that represents the reporting structure and the hierarchy. Category 3, a person holding some soil with a leaf growing out of it represents growth and development. Here we're talking about using metaphors and analogies. How can you use one thing to describe or to explain something else? Even Aristotle said the ability to use an effective metaphor is a sign of genius, right? So explaining something, my love is like a red, red rose, or this is just the tip of the iceberg. We use metaphorical language all the time because it helps to make the unfamiliar familiar and the abstract concrete and the invisible visible. And that's what we're trying to do right now, is make the invisible visible. And the final category represents by the 2 speaking bubbles is storytelling and humor. If you use humor as appropriate, we're not talking about a joke like 2 guys walked into a bar. We're talking about telling a humorous anecdote that resonates with your audience, that's not offensive, that is relatable. But storytelling, why stories? Stories are emotional, they are human, they make you vulnerable. If I tell you do this or don't do this, you may or may not remember. But if I tell you a story about the worst mistake I ever made or my biggest success, right? It could be a success story, it could be a cautionary tale, but stories are how culture is passed along, right? Children tell stories, grandparents tell stories. These are 4 different ways, interrelated, by the way. You could show an image and tell a story about it. You could show a framework and use a metaphor to explain it, right? So I just want to mention that even though I'm breaking them down into these 4 bite-sized pieces, they are interrelated, and when used in combination, even more powerful. So let me give you an example. I could spend an hour just on each of these 4 slices. I want to give you one example that will illustrate all 4 in one, just because of the limited time that we have together today. One of the things I do is I volunteer for Big Apple Greeter in New York. Here's my button to prove it that I wear when I show people around. So if you ever come to New York after the pandemic, sign up at Big Apple Greeter. I'll give you a walking tour of wherever you want to go, whatever you want to see. So that's something I've been voluntarily doing for the last 20 years, just to make New York a friendlier place. We don't get paid for it. It's just New Yorkers sharing our city. So this is interesting. I just want to hit the pause button for a second, which is a metaphor. When I'm showing people around New York from other cities and countries, people who've never been here before, people who've only seen New York in movies and TV shows, I see the city through their lens. I experience the joy and the excitement from their perspective as they look up at the Empire State Building, as they look at the Statue of Liberty. That's something we want to do with our presentations. We may be so familiar with our content, but if we see it through the lens of our listeners, of our audience, we're going to be excited. Our 2 P's, passion and purpose, are going to shine through. So I just want to mention that. So this is really not only in showing people around your city or your town, but showing people around your content in your presentation. So here's a real life example. I was showing around this couple visiting from London, and here we are in Chinatown, as you can see, and I'm pointing things out to them, right? So in the course of showing them around, they ask me questions and I tell them stories. They want to know, where did you grow up? Where do people shop? Which are the best restaurants? What was your best New York experience? What was your scariest New York experience? You know, so whatever it is, we communicate through storytelling. So that's number 4. So I'm not going in order. I'm just showing you 4 different examples. So here's storytelling. Now, let's say I want to explain to them how to use the New York subway system. I can explain it like this without, so you take the 1 train up to the Upper West Side, and then you're going to transfer to the 86 bus. You're not going to remember that, right? I show you a subway map and I say, you take the red line, and I point it out and I show them where to switch. They're going to remember it, right? That is the power of using visual imagery. A map is just one example of using a visual image to capture information and to communicate information. Now, let's say they've never been on the New York subway before, but they've been on the tube in London. What can I do? I could say, this is like that. Our red line is this, your red line is that. What does that do? It gets people to frame something that they're familiar with and then translate it into what the unfamiliar, into what they are now learning, right? So if someone has a mental model of something, we could use that as the foundation and then build on it, right? So this is why, as Andrea was saying before, if we know our audience, if we know what do they know, what do they think, what are their biases and assumptions, people, our audiences have 2 thought bubbles hanging over their heads at all time. They say, why should I care? And what's in it for me? People want to know, why should this be interesting to me? And how will I benefit from this? If you can't answer those 2 questions, then people are not going to be engaged in your content and your presentation, right? So you want to know, what is their mental model? What is their framework? And the way to do that is just ask, where are you from, right? What's an analogy that will resonate with them, which leads us into the next piece, is metaphors and analogies, right? So if I tell them, you know, which is older, the New York subway or London? London is older. Which is longer? Which has more stations, handles more passengers, or is open 24 hours? Those are all New York. So when you compare something that someone's familiar with to something that they're not, they will then start to understand by connecting the dots. So that's one of the most valuable and powerful things we could do as a presenter, is help our audience connect the dots. So here's a question. Which is taller, the Statue of Liberty or the Eiffel Tower? Type it in the chat box. What's your guess? What are we seeing, Andrea?
Eiffel Tower, Liberty, Eiffel Tower, Liberty, a bit of both.
Okay,
Todd.
all right, great. So I knew the Eiffel Tower was bigger, but until I looked at the visual, I had no idea how much bigger. Look at this. So this is a visual illustration for comparison. So if I told you the Eiffel Tower is 324 meters and the Statue of Liberty is 93 meters, I have no idea what that means because we don't use the metric system in the United States, and I have no idea what a meter is, right? So I need it in feet, right? But you look at a picture, the numbers don't matter. The imagery makes the case. Similarly, if someone asks which is taller, the Eiffel Tower or the World Trade Center, the New Freedom Tower, here's the comparison here, right? So again, I knew the Trade Center was taller. I didn't know how much taller until I saw the image. So if you look at them side by side, look at the height difference, right? So to give someone information in numbers, in meters or in feet, it is not as relevant as when you can show them a visual picture that regardless of what language you speak, regardless of what numbering system you use, this picture speaks 1,000 words and answers that question for you. So again, that's the power of visual imagery. Now, so those are the 4 ways to think more and communicate more visually. So I only have a minute left, so I just want to wrap this up. What do the first 2 have in common and the second 2 have in common? The first 2 are visible to the eye. We take in visual imagery, drawing, pictures, models, frameworks through our eye, through looking at it and seeing it. However, the metaphors and analogies and storytelling and humor are visible to the ear to mix our metaphors. So using Andrea's example of the blind audience, we could still use visual communication if we communicate it in an auditory way. So I just want to make that point very clear, because you may say, oh, visuals don't apply because we can't see your slides, or people are have sight issues. Here, you could still use visual imagery to communicate your message. Visual imagery in combination with visual language, dual coding theory, and you're more likely to hit your target. So with that, I just want to leave you with this final quote. And this is from the French novelist Marcel Proust, who said that the real voyage of discovery consists not in seeking new lands, but in seeing with new eyes. And so hopefully when you leave here today, you'll see the world and your presentations with new eyes and start to incorporate some of these techniques that Andrea and I talked about today into your presentation. So for more, please check out my book, Visual Leadership, or visit my website and go to toddchurches.com. You can download my list of my top 52 visual leadership books, and you can also watch my TED Talk. So with that, I thank you for your time, and I'm going to turn it back over to Andrea and Phil.
Excellent. Well, Todd, thank you so much indeed. So this is Phil here, and Andrea has asked me to do a little summary of what you just told us in 20 minutes or so I can give the really short version, which would be visuals matter. I can give a slightly longer version, which would be, let's all remember the pictorial superiority effect. A picture really is worth 1,000 words. It's not just a statement, it actually makes a difference. In fact, so much of our brain is actually devoted to visual processing. So even if people can't see the images, if you can get people to imagine something, if you can paint a picture with your words and have them imagine the image in their head, well, that can be extremely powerful. So remember the pictorial superiority effect. Remember also the dual coding theory. So images on their own are great, but the images help you to remember things. What do they help you to remember? That's where some text can actually help them to remember what it is you want them to remember. Otherwise, you show them a picture and they remember the picture. They're not quite sure what they're supposed to remember with it. So those two are really important. And remember the ACR. So attention, comprehension, retention. I hope I've remembered some of these things, but at the end of the day, getting people's attention is necessary. Getting them to understand, to comprehend what you're saying is important. If they don't retain anything, if they don't remember anything afterwards, there's no point. And pictures are so powerful. Images are so powerful in helping them not only to get to comprehend your message and to pay attention to it, but also to remember it. So we can all incorporate the power of visual thinking and visual leadership in the way that we communicate, and it will certainly make our communication that much more powerful. The last thing I would want to say here and to remind is it all depends on what resonates with your audience. So if we were to talk about meters, indeed, it won't resonate very much with Todd. If we talk about football, he'll be thinking about people wearing padding instead of people kicking a ball around. And an example, a very visual example that I can give to finish this off is a few years ago, I was giving a presentation in Japan, and I'd been thinking about this. I've been thinking about, I need something to represent like genius, brilliance, or whatever. And naturally, the first thing that occurred to me was I could show a picture of Albert Einstein. So I look at a picture of Einstein and I'm thinking genius, brilliant physicist, etc. In Japan, they look at him and think contributed to atomic bomb. So luckily I realized that before I actually gave that presentation, and I made sure I replaced that with something more appropriate. But you've got to have images which resonate with your audience. So always, as Andrea said, take the time to think who you're presenting to, the audience, their burning need, and the context, and then you can leverage the power of visual thinking. So with that, I would like to say a big thank you to Todd and a big thank you to Andrea. And you're not going to thank me because I am now going to ask you all of these difficult questions on behalf of our participants. So I'm going to start off with a question which came from Lola, and this is for Andrea. How do you deal with multiple audiences? So for example, in the same room, you've got different people or different services with different interests. How do you prepare for that?
Yeah. Great question, Lola. Yeah, absolutely, because this is something that happens quite often. Now, what I would say there is, first of all, it goes back to knowing your audience. So who are these people in the audience? Different services, different interests. So it goes back to the ABC. That's the very first thing. Know your audience. Try to understand as much as possible about them, about their burning needs. Then what you can do, for example, just a little technique, in the introduction, you can make it very clear that you're going to cover some points, some key points. And point number one could be about, I'm just making it up now, it could be about sales. Point number two could be about logistics. Point number three could be about accounting, depending on who the audience is. So you make it very clear to them from the very beginning that you've built your presentation to accommodate everybody's needs. And then another thing on top of that, you could also create, sometimes with our clients, we create modular presentations, which means that you've got a sort of menu slide, and you make it very clear from the beginning that you can cover all of those areas. And then depending on what they need, you can quickly jump at the particular section that they are mostly interested in. As a brief answer, does that answer Lola's question? She can feel free, Lola, feel free to make any other comments in the chat box if you want to. Yes, she says yes. Okay, perfect.
She does. Fantastic. Thank you very much, Andrea. Okay, so I've got a question here. This was in fact the first question asked. This was from Mike. And I'm going to ask this one to Todd because you've been using your slides really well there. Which tools do you use to switch animations on and off in your slides?
I use PowerPoint. I know there's Keynote and Prezi and different types of things. This was all PowerPoint. And there's two ways of doing it. One is through animations, and the other is through builds. And not to get into the technical, aspects of it, but in animation, you have one slide where each element comes up 1, 2, 3, 4 with each quick click of the mouse. I like using separate slides so I could see them visually, and if I need to make changes or whatever. So one slide, what looks like one slide may in fact be 5 or 10 slides, right? So that's why when a client says something like, you're limited to only 10 slides, you're limited to 20 slides, Nancy Duarte, who's one of our gurus of presentation skills, says, push back on that. Don't ever, because what happens is if you're limited in the number of slides you're allowed, what do? You overpack those slides with too much information, and then you defeat the whole purpose. So don't worry about how many slides. In my presentation, those 20 minutes, I forget how many, but it was probably 100 slides. My NYU graduate class, at the end of my course, I asked my students how many slides they think they saw over the 14 sessions. And most of them guess around 200 or 300. It's 2,000. They saw two. And now what if I said to them, welcome to our course. Over the next 14 weeks, you're going to see 2,000 slides. Half the students would drop the class like right then, right? But you don't realize it if it's done visually and effectively.
Great. Thank you, Todd. Question then from Eran. I'm going to try and get through all of these. I'm going to ask this one to Andrea first, and Todd, if you want to jump in, you're very welcome to. How can you make Zoom meetings more fun and engaging for the audience?
Okay, great question, and very relevant, of course, at the moment. The key thing is to try and create moments of interaction throughout the meeting. And this applies to a Zoom meeting, it applies to a presentation. You need to create some moments of change and interaction. If you have a meeting or a presentation where it's just one-way communication, you sharing your information for an hour, it's not going to work. Today, it's even in an online world, it's even harder to keep the attention high. So I would say in a face-to-face presentation or meeting, then every 10 minutes, you should try and do something and change something in the pattern. Online, even more than that, my recommendation is that try to do something, make the audience do something. Like, for example, a quick exclamation mark in the chat box, asking them a question, inviting them to do something, to think about something every 5 minutes or so. And if you do that, either in a presentation or in a Zoom meeting, you are going to make it much easier for them to listen to you, to follow you, and you're also going to make it fun for them. And because I see the field has disappeared, Todd, if you want to share your ideas, we can do that.
Yeah, sure. I could talk about this for hours. One of my roles at NYU is I do faculty development, and I train professors how to transition from lecture and textbook to experiential learning. So I could talk about this for hours. And last semester, I had never taught online before or through Zoom, even though NYU had been asking me for years. Last semester, the first 7 sessions of my course were in person, and then 24 hours later, the pandemic hit, classes were all online, and I had to figure out in 24 hours how to replicate the in-person experience as much as possible online. And it took like 1 or 2 sessions to figure it out, but that's the thing. It's like use the chat box, use the whiteboards, use breakout sessions, try to incorporate some element of surprise, tell people to expect the unexpected. I did a team breakout, right? I put people in breakout rooms for a team project and told them they had 10 minutes. 5 minutes into it, I lifted one person out of each room and put them in another room. So all of a sudden they were like, it's like I Dream of Jeannie. It's like you blink and it's like that person just disappeared. This was a session on team building, right? What happens when you're on a team and you're removed? What happens when you're on a team and a new person is thrown in? How do you onboard them? What if you were the leader of the team and all of a sudden you left your team behind leaderless? So just in that one exercise in 10 minutes, I replicated a real life experience that people were like, wow, that was amazing, right? So have some fun with it, be creative, be experiential and interactive. And again, I could talk about this for a long time, but that's the key thing. I just want to give you my 3 V's, rule of 3: visibility, voice, and value. Visibility is, are you seen and how are you seen? Voice is, are you heard and how are you heard? And value is, are you seen as being a contributor? If you're not on camera, if you don't turn your mics on when you're asked to, then you're not being seen and you're not being heard, a little bit through the chat box, but you're not contributing the value to the level that you're capable of. So that's how I get people. I know a lot of people here have their camera off, but in general, when I say the 3 V's, that tends to make the cameras pop on because people want to be seen and heard and make a contribution. So anyway, I'll end there because I could go on for hours, but those are some of my key thoughts on how to do that.
Okay, that's excellent, Todd. Thanks a lot. So we've still got a few questions and we don't have so much time. So I'm going to ask for rapid fire answers here, but I do want to try to get to as many of these questions as we can. So a quick one for, I'm going to ask Andrea this. You're an Italian in the UK. Zach is asking, any resources to find out what is culturally acceptable when presenting to a certain country?
Okay, interesting question. Now, because you asked me to be very, very quick, my quick answer is no, I don't know. I don't have an answer to that question. So I don't know. Also, Phil, you've got experience in other countries as well, in Japan. Do you have an answer to that in terms of actual resources? That's why I'm saying I don't have an answer.
Right. So this is where the questioner gets questioned. Thank you, Andrea. Actually, I do have an answer. There's a fantastic book which is called Speaking Globally. It's actually 22 years old. It was published in '98 by Elizabeth Urech. And I had the pleasure of actually seeing her in person when I was a lot younger back then. And this book covers several countries, not every country, but it talks about certain things which are specific in their culture and how you can make connections with them. So Speaking Globally, I'll put that in the chat in a moment once I've asked the next question. So I hope that's going to be helpful. Another question, in fact, from Zach, and I'm asking this because it's, I think, a really good one. This one's for Todd. So he says, your 4 methods are excellent, says Zach. Hard to incorporate them all standing out. I think this means the 4 different types of the visual communication here. I imagine it gets to be more natural. Which do you recommend are easier to implement as you practice them while being impactful?
I'm going to give you a 2-word answer, which is the answer to 90% of all questions you're ever asked. It depends. So that's not a cop-out. The magic, you can make a lot of money as a consultant just answering every question with it depends. You get paid the big bucks if you can figure out what it depends on, right? I would say it depends on what comes naturally to you. Of the 4 categories, which one do you gravitate towards? Are you more comfortable with? Start with the quick and easier wins. Like if you're more of a storyteller, start with that. If you like picking up a pen and sketching out an idea, start with that. So that's what I would say is start with what works for you and then just try 1 or 2 other things. And then you start. One of the things people realize, you already do this stuff. What we're doing is putting some framework around it. We're creating more heightened sense of awareness. We already use metaphors. We already tell stories, right? So that's what I would say is find what you're already doing, get better at that, and then add the other things to your repertoire. But the best way to do it, little plug, is just to read my book because I go into details on how to do each of those 4 things in the book.
Very subtle plug there, Todd, but it's a great book, and I certainly would recommend you do get a copy of that. I'm gonna have to ask one last question, and Todd, I'm gonna ask this to you before I hand back to Andrea. This one comes from Hugh. So Hugh says, I make good infographics. Sure you do, Hugh. I'm sure they're fantastic, but I'm terrible at drawing. Me too. However, I find that on Zoom training or presentations, people actually like me to draw interactively, even though the picture is terrible. Is it recommended to draw?
I'm going to put it in the chat box. I just wrote my first article for Inc. magazine called Can You Draw What Your Company Does? and I took a client through an exercise where everyone had to draw and explain what the company did on a flip chart using metaphors. Here's the thing. Get rid of ICD, which is I can't draw syndrome. If you ask a group of kindergartners how many of you can draw, they all raise their hand. You ask business professionals, none of them raise their hand. Have we lost our ability or our confidence since we were 5 years old? My guess is it's our confidence. We're not judging you based on your artistic abilities. We're gauging how well you could communicate an idea. So if you could draw a stick figure, a circle, a square, you can do it. And it just takes practice and you'll get better at it. It's a skill like any other. So get rid of that ICD constraint that we put on ourselves and just get up there, grab a marker and start drawing away. If you can play Pictionary and charades, you can draw in a business context as well.
I completely agree with that, Todd. In fact, one of the best presentations I ever saw was from the chief executive of a company I used to work in. He got up on stage with a flip chart. He was drawing for about 40 minutes. By the end of it, it looked like nothing at all. I took a photograph of it, showed it to a colleague that was like, what's that mess? But during the presentation, it was really clear because of the process of drawing that he was going through, and it really helped us to understand it. So visual thinking can be very powerful, even if you don't think you can draw. It makes a big difference. And indeed, James is pointing out in the chat, Dan Rome's Back of the Napkin book is really, really worth having. So that's a useful compliment, but don't forget to get Todd's book first. I'm going to hand back to Andrea for a conclusion. I want to thank everybody for all of your contributions, and I want to thank Todd in particular as our special guest today. Great presentation, wonderful to hear from you, and thanks for taking your time. Andrea, over to you.
Thanks for having me, Phil, and thanks, Andrea, as well.
Thank you, Todd, also from my side. And I also want to thank, of course, everybody who attended today, and you, Phil, as well. You've done, as always, a wonderful job supporting us. And we've got just 1 minute. So if there is one thing I would really like you to remember is this. I believe that there's never been a better time for you to become better presenters and communicators. Why? Because if you look at what's happening in the world with things like automation and artificial intelligence and robots and technology, and also the fact that today in most parts of the world, everywhere, we can only present online. And so it's even harder to get your message across. So think about it. If you want to land your dream job or sell products or lead teams or build brands or trigger movements, if you want to do any of these things, then you need to be able to persuade people. You need to be able to inspire them. And this is not something that a robot will be able to do, never. This is not something that now Zoom will do for you. You still need to take responsibility for communicating your ideas effectively. And so that's why being able to communicate and present effectively is a skill that will become only more important, no less. So if you are here today, it's because maybe not, but maybe you are only at the beginning of your journey to becoming the best presenter, the best communicator you can be. And I can promise you, it's the smallest investment you can make in yourselves in order to make the biggest difference to your business or career. So keep going, you won't regret it, and your audience will always thank you. And I also want to thank you very much again. Thanks everybody for attending. Thank you, Phil. Thank you, Todd. All the very best. Let's keep in touch.